So good morning, everybody. And again, I hope everybody's doing well and everybody's safe. Today, as I mentioned to you last week, we're going to take a closer look and try to make some sense of the long-standing conflict that is presently unfolding in Nagorno-Karabakh. Michel, if you could show the first map. A beautiful highland region. The name literally means mountainous black garden that you can see in brown here on the map, which is part of the southern, just to locate it for you, which is part of the southern area of the Caucasus Mountains that separates, if you will, Europe from Asia. From the Black Sea, as you can see in the west, all the way to the Caspian Sea in the east. Now, in the latest developments, so to speak, from the front, Secretary Pompeo met on Friday or Saturday in Washington with the foreign ministers of the two warring parties in Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia, that you also can see on the map here, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. He was trying to, and we'll come back to that a little later. He was trying to work out some kind of agreement between the parties in order to reestablish a truce or a ceasefire. From the fighting, which had taken a significantly higher toll than either side has acknowledged, according to the Russian sources, and they are well positioned to monitor the situation because they are nearby. According to Russia, the number of deaths up to now, from the time the fighting has started about a month ago, on 27th of September, was nearing 5,000, which is about 5 times more than official estimates have suggested on both sides. Now, this conflict, which is a direct result of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the subsequent accession to independence of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia and in the Southern Caucasus, including Armenia and Azerbaijan. This conflict had received relatively little attention in the West, despite the fact that it is perhaps the most dangerous flashpoint across post-Soviet Eurasia. Its origins can be traced back to the Kremlin's decision to include the Armenian majority region, which is Nagorno-Karabakh, into Azerbaijan. Michel, can you go to map 2, please? Thank you. This The reason for this Soviet decision to include this Armenian, again, Armenian majority region into Azerbaijan was a way to appease Azerbaijan back in the 1920s. We're talking about immediately after the creation of the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and then the subsequent creation of the Soviet Union. It was a way to appease the Azerbaijani population, which was going to be absorbed into the Soviet system, the Soviet Empire, becoming one of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union. And also, to some extent, to gain support for this inclusion, so to speak, forceful, of the new nationalist government of Ataturk next door in Turkey. That was not a big deal at the time. Why? Because both Armenia, as I explained to you, Armenia and Azerbaijan were part of the Soviet Empire, with many Armenians living in their neighboring republic, and vice versa. A little bit like the situation in former Yugoslavia, where Croatians and Bosnians lived in Serbia and Serbs lived in Slovenia and Bosnia. It was one country. Here there were two republics, but basically people could go from one to the next. The religious differences between predominantly Christian Orthodox Armenians and predominantly Shiite Muslims in Armenia was not a big deal, since they all lived in an officially atheist state. The problem started in the late 1990s. During the Gorbachev, early 1990s, during the Gorbachev era of transparency and openness, when ethnic Armenians began demanding Nagorno-Karabakh transfer to Armenia. Moscow refused at the time, and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, excuse me, a full-scale war broke out between these two newly independent countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which itself had unilaterally declared its own independence from Azerbaijan. The war itself was both tragic and sometimes farcical. For instance, the disintegration of the Soviet Union created huge number of Russian mercenaries who fought on both sides, sometimes switching overnight. Also, criminals thrived among this chaos. As an example, the only day that flights took off again from the capitals of the two countries, Baku in Azerbaijan and Yerevan in Armenia, was when an Armenian mobster died in 1993, and his Azerbaijani colleagues wished to pay their respect at his funeral. But the war at the time, which lasted from 1991 roughly to 1994, was mostly tragic, as some 20,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed and another 1 million displaced through ethnic cleansing. About 70% of them Azerbaijanis fleeing from Armenia back to Azerbaijan, and maybe 30% of Armenians fleeing Azerbaijani-held territory back to Armenia. With Azerbaijan led at the time by a pan-Turkish nationalist, Russia forces largely supported the Armenian side. Armenia gained the upper hand on the ground thanks to the Russian support. And a Russian brokered ceasefire in May 1994 followed. Now, on the ground, Azerbaijan's military, which is far better equipped than Armenia's, seized control during the latest fights. But we come back to this a little later. Let's follow it chronologically. So in 1994, Armenia took control of this territory within Azerbaijan, actually, and not only over Nagorno-Karabakh, but also over 7 surrounding districts that you can see also in brown here. Nagorno-Karabakh itself is in red, and everything that surrounds it here on the, is in brown, is Armenian-held, controlled territory. Now, for Azerbaijan, the arrangement could only be temporary. Losing the war caused deep trauma in the country. First, because of the territorial loss and suffering of the Azerbaijanis expelled from Armenia. Azerbaijanis, who represented about 10% of the Azerbaijan population. Their desire to return to their homeland has been a potential political force in Azerbaijan ever since, providing domestic support for the intransigent positions of the Azerbaijani leadership, including the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, whose family actually hails from a village taken or controlled today by Armenia. And the second reason was that because of the relative size and strengths of the two countries, indeed, you can tell from the map, Azerbaijan is much larger than Armenia and has 3 times the population of Armenia. Azerbaijan has around 10 million people, and Armenia versus 3.5, not even 3 maybe, in Armenia. So that led to a huge variety of conspiracy theories around the reason why Azerbaijan lost the war, including the widespread belief that somehow the United States had secretly backed the Armenian side. In reality, however, the Armenian forces had simply been better led, less corrupt, and more committed. Russia, which is next door, you can see here north of Armenia, Azerbaijan. Russia had also increasingly supported Armenia, sending shipment of weapons and providing military training. However, since the end of the war in 1994, Azerbaijan's rising energy wealth, particularly natural gas and oil, allowed Azerbaijan to build up its military with armed drones and other sophisticated weaponry from Turkey, from Russia, and from Israel in particular, that, according to military experts, exceeds Armenia's military capabilities. As for Armenia, in order to keep a stronger position in potential negotiations to just incorporate Nagorno, Armenia resisted the temptation to just incorporate Nagorno-Karabakh into its own territory, maintaining it rather as a nominally independent republic that no other country recognizes, including Armenia. Instead, the international community, since the early 1990s, since the war between Armenia, the first war, I should say, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, has been trying to return this territory, which again, as you can tell from the map, is within Azerbaijan territory. They tried to return Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan while preserving the safety of Armenians in that region. Again, this region is mostly in majority Armenian populated. 90% of this population is of Armenian origin, and 10% only of Azerbaijani origin. We're talking here about a very small territory and very few people. All of Nagorno-Karabakh, just to give you an idea, has 150,000 people. So it's not by any stretch of imagination a large area. Now, in 1992, a group of countries, members of the so-called Minsk group. Minsk is the capital of Belarus, and that's where the group met for the first time. That's where the name comes from. Was set up by the Organization for the so-called Security and Cooperation in Europe. This group of countries is chaired by the United States, Russia, and France. And over the years, it worked somewhat successfully with the parties, with the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, to reach some kind of agreement towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Having those two countries accept in 2009 a set of principles, so-called the Madrid principles, which stipulated that Armenia would give up the periphery, which is, again, this area in brown, occupied around Nagorno-Karabakh by the Armenian forces, that two, that displaced population would be allowed to return to their homes, three, and that both countries and outside powers would guarantee the rights of the residents of the disputed region, and finally, that the status of the territory would eventually be resolved. In practice, however, those provisions have never been implemented. Armenia had no desire to give up Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan had no incentive to relinquish its claim to the territory, which again, it's within Azerbaijani borders. Now, the current clashes, which broke out on September 27, as I said earlier, are hardly the first ones since the 1994 ceasefire. A sporadic sniping across the line of contact is common. The line of contact is basically separates the armed forces of the two countries over an area of about 200 kilometers, which is not a large area. It's about 150, 160 miles. In April 2016, for instance, 4 years ago, an Azerbaijani offensive recaptured several strategic high points, leaving around 200 dead. Although Moscow was able to convince the two governments to return to the ceasefire after a few days, the clash was a warning sign that the status quo, frozen in place since 1994, as I said earlier, was in danger of unraveling. Now, in the past few weeks, those unheeded scars erupted into a modern-day conflagration of trench warfare, drone strikes, and artillery bombardments. The most recent fighting do not seem to have changed dramatically the balance of power in the area. For instance, the Armenians still hold on to the heights in Nagorno-Karabakh, although it seems, according again to Russian sources, that Azerbaijan forces have been successful in taking over some of these, a few villages, but not in Nagorno-Karabakh itself, surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. But their advance militarily is made very difficult because of the mountainous area where they have to fight. And assessments, military assessments, despite these few local Azerbaijani successes, still rank Azerbaijan's military readiness as poor. They still rank its army as unhappy and inefficient, with a desertion rate running at close to 20%. And they still rank the army as lacking the training and doctrine necessary to make efficient use of the modern weaponry that they had acquired in the past 20 so years. Armenia, to date, Armenia officially acknowledged that it had a difficult time in a way holding on to all those areas, but they do not acknowledge the loss of any territory. So we don't know for sure. Now, during these latest fights, again, Armenia admitted having had 500 casualties, and Azerbaijan hasn't put out any numbers. But as I told you earlier, according to the Russians, 5,000 people died up to now in 4 weeks of fighting. So that prompted the leaders of this Minsk group to try and bring the parties together in order to have another ceasefire. First, Putin tried about 10 days ago to talk to the two presidents, but the ceasefire collapsed even before implementation. Then it was the turn of the French last week to bring the parties together, and that has failed. And finally, as I told you earlier also, Pompeo in Washington brought the two foreign ministers together, meeting them separately and not at the same time, which is not a good sign usually. And the ceasefire, which was supposed to be implemented this morning, collapsed. Apparently, the fighting has resumed. So at this time, there is the outbreak of violence is, as you can tell, even more concerning than the past ones for two reasons, basically. First, because unlike previous bouts of fighting, this one may result in a full-fledged war between the two countries, and not only between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, but between Baku and Yerevan, between the two countries, both of which are facing increasing internal pressure to resort to harsh measures. In Armenia, the government of Prime Minister Pashinyan, who came to power amid a popular uprising in 2018, and popular uprising that Russia largely opposed, is worried about what it sees as Moscow's increasingly ambivalent support for maintaining the status quo, which pushes him obviously to harden his position, including recently calling the formal integration of Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia. And in Azerbaijan, an economic downturn resulting from the recent crash in oil prices and gas prices, and the frustration with the increasingly authoritarian ruling and of President Aliyev has fed popular discontent. To divert people's attention from the current economic situation and mobilize nationalist support, President Aliyev is running the risk of being outflanked by public opinion. Actually, since the fighting have started, protesters stormed the parliament building in Baku, in Azerbaijan, demanding war with Armenia. And the second reason is that because unlike many other so-called frozen conflicts in the former Soviet Union, the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute is driven almost entirely by local actors. To be sure, Russia remains the most important outside player, but its ability to manage, much less control, the conflict is limited. Russia maintains upward to 5,000 soldiers in Armenia, which most Armenians tolerate as a guarantee of their security. But Moscow has also recently cultivated good relations with Azerbaijan and is a leading supplier of weapons to both sides, as I said earlier. Both sides, which understand that any resolution, however, to the conflict can come only with Russian support. During previous skirmishes, Russian officials were instrumental in brokering a truce. But today, Moscow obviously has little interest in a wider conflict, which could force it to make difficult choices and decisions about how far to take its commitments to previous commitment to Armenia, and to devote additional sources to the South Caucasus at a time when it's already, as you know, engaged Russia on multiple other fronts in its own backyard, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and in Kyrgyzstan, actually. They come to mind right away. But while Russia remains the most important regional power broker, another external power with historical ties to the region, President Erdogan's Turkey, which you can see here on the map, has increasingly sought to shape the outcome of the conflict. Turkey sided with Azerbaijan in the initial conflict in the 1990s, and the two countries share close ethnic and cultural ties. Turkish officials describe the relationship as one nation, two states, just to show you how close this relationship is. Until recently, however, Turkey's involvement in this regional dispute was relatively limited. But as Ankara adopted a more assertive posture in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, as we saw in our previous lectures, it has become more forthright in its support for Azerbaijan. In the past 12 months alone, Ankara has sold Azerbaijan a wide range of weapons and electronic warfare equipment. And once the fighting started, reportedly dispatched Syrian mercenaries controlled and financed by Turkey. To make things clear, Erdogan declared that Turkey would remain by the side of our friend and brother Azerbaijan, and demanded that Armenia immediately return Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan, calling it occupied territory. Now, Turkey's deepening involvement in Nagorno-Karabakh is a dangerous game. Why? First, because it only encourages Azerbaijan to take an uncompromising stance and resist calls for a ceasefire. Second, it could transform the conflict, which is a regional conflict, into an existential one in the eyes of the Armenian public, especially in light of the massacres of Armenians committed but still denied by the Ottoman forces in 1915. Third, it could be perceived as Ankara's most overt challenge to Russian influence in the former Soviet Union, where Moscow is extremely protective of its claims to preeminence. In addition, this overlapping of Russian and Turkish forces in many other theaters of operation in the area could give Moscow multiple opportunities to spread this South Caucasus conflict to other areas where Ankara and Moscow are at odds. In particular, to Libya and to Syria, where their proxies, Turkish and Russian proxies, have engaged in occasional clashes because they support and back different forces over there. Also, Turkey's active involvement risks fraying further its relatively tense relations with many of its NATO allies. Let's not forget that Turkey has purchased Russian air defensive system, angering Washington, has squared off with Greece and France in the Eastern Mediterranean, antagonizing the European Union member states, invaded western eastern Syria, and got involved in the civil war in Libya, annoying Russia. Now, many are wondering where the breaking point is or how close it might be, especially with a potential US Democratic administration signaling a much tougher line on Turkey than President Trump's. Already, Canada, which is a fellow NATO member state of Turkey, announced it was halting some weapons sales to Turkey after allegation that its military equipment was used by Azerbaijani forces. And other NATO member states fear that the bilateral tensions with Turkey would spill over into the alliance's deliberation, which in turn could hamstring NATO's ability to make decisions in other matters of concern related to Russia, the Middle East, and other challenges to the transatlantic alliance. Some NATO countries, since NATO countries, NATO operates, as I said to you earlier, with consensus decision making, nothing can be decided until all 30 member states agree. And having Turkey on the side might undermine this whole construction. And now, last but not least, there is the United States. Now, you might wonder why the United States would get involved in the Southern Caucasus. This interest has a name. Michel, if you can put up map number 3, please. And its name is Ganja Gap, right here. You can see it in black. Now, Ganja Gap is in proximity, located next to Ganja. Ganja is the second largest city of Azerbaijan. Now, when I talk about ganja, I'm not talking about drug trafficking. Probably that's what comes to mind. This is not Afghanistan. We are talking about here about a 60-mile wide corridor through which natural gas pipeline is being built, linking, as I showed you on the previous map, the Caspian Sea in the east through Turkey. You cannot see Turkey here, but it goes from Kyrgyzstan, which is on the other side of the Caspian Sea. So there is a pipeline that goes under the Caspian Sea and then through Azerbaijan, near Armenia, Azerbaijani-Armenian border, all the way. It's in green, all the way to Turkey, which you cannot see here on the map, and then on to Western Europe. Its huge advantage, strategic advantage of this South Caucasus pipeline, as it is called, is that it circumvents both Russia and Iran. Because a number of pipelines which have been built over the years carrying natural gas and oil from this area go through Russia. This one would not. Now, Ganja's gap history as a source of trade and commerce dates back to the Silk Road that once crossed Eurasia. Even today, any grand strategy that takes into account a resurgent Russia, an emboldened Iran, and an economically expanding China has to reckon with this little tiny 60-mile gap. Why is that? First, I want to remind you that Western Europe depends up to 40% of its consumption on Russian oil and natural gas deliveries, which makes, obviously, Europe vulnerable to Russian pressure and also reluctant to adopt tough sanctions against Moscow on a number of critical issues, such as Ukraine or Syria, much to the displeasure, obviously, of the United States. Naturally, also, the United States benefits whenever Europe reduces its gas and oil dependence on Russia and welcomes any barrel of oil and cubic meter of gas that Europe can buy from Azerbaijan, from Kazakhstan, or from Kyrgyzstan. 3 oil and gas-rich ex-Soviet republics in Central Asia, rather than importing them, obviously, from Russia. Also, given Russia's track record of using energy as a tool of aggression or blackmail, Washington worries that the proximity of the Ganja Gap to the front line of Nagorno-Karabakh that you see here in yellow might lead the Kremlin to encourage Armenia to provoke new fighting that could threaten the viability of those pipelines. Now, with the United States leverage relatively limited in Armenia, Washington has turned its efforts since the 1990s, early 1990s, to establish a close relations with Azerbaijan in the number of areas, most notably energy cooperation. And since 2009-11, 2001, counterterrorism. As a result, Azerbaijan's 120 troops in Afghanistan give it a larger troop presence than some NATO members, including Spain, the Netherlands, and Norway. And the Ganja gap is more than just oil and gas. Through a network of fiber optic cables, it links Western Europe with the Caspian region. Through the second longest European highway, the E60, highway that connects Brest, which is on the French Atlantic coast, with Kyrgyzstan, which, as I told you, it's on the other side of the Caspian Sea. It's strategic for Western Europe. And it also connects the railway that goes from Baku in Azerbaijan to Tbilisi, which you can see also on the map here, which is the capital of Georgia, and then on to Kars, which is in Turkey. It connects Azerbaijan to Turkey via Georgia, and that's map number 5, I think, Michel. Here. Azerbaijan, Tbilisi, and Turkey. Doesn't go to Russia. So you can, all these connections are said to become potentially vital for Western Europe and obviously for the United States. Finally, this Ganja gap has proven very important strategically during the US military campaign in Afghanistan, providing at the peak of the war an overland and air passage for non-lethal military supplies such as fuel, food, and clothing to US and NATO troops. So you can tell that the US has a big stake also strategically and politically in this area. And as a matter of fact, I heard yesterday President Trump during a rally in New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't hear the details, but I heard him say that the United States was going to help Armenia also in this conflict. So the US recognizes that its influence in Armenia is relatively limited considering the presence of the Russians there, and they decided to help Armenia as well in order to keep all these pipelines. The latest pipeline, the one that I mentioned to you, which circumvents Russia, does not work, does not function yet. It's being still under construction. And the fighting obviously will delay its completion, which was supposed to be, I believe, for next year. So for the time being, the Western European countries still depend and will be depending in the foreseeable future on the Russian gas delivery. When I say Russian gas delivery, the gas does not come from Russia. It originates in Central Asia here, but it's carried through pipelines through Russia. So obviously that makes Western Europe vulnerable to any type of Russian retribution for any type of sanctions that the Western Europeans would adopt against Russia's meddling in the Middle East, in Syria, or their occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine. So keeping access to the Ganja gap is the best example of the so-called principal realism, as outlined in the 2017 National Security Strategy, US National Security Strategy. In that document, the Trump administration emphasized the need to develop good relations with stable allies, including in the South Caucasus, in order to decrease tensions in the region and help secure vital energy, communications, and trade corridors. In that respect, the establishment of close ties with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, by the way, which is the only country in the world which had common borders both with Russia and Iran, which is very important strategically, makes perfect sense. And for the US diplomacy in the region, regardless of the next administration. So I know it's a bit complicated, but I hope you have a better understanding and it's clear or clearer to you why this fighting between two such remote countries from the United States and from Europe as well, why this fighting is so closely monitored in Western Europe and the United States, and how much is at stake politically, in terms of relations with Turkey and Russia, and to some extent Iran, by the way, with the fighting resuming apparently between Azerbaijan and Armenia, very close to Iran and Iranian territory. The Iranians complained yesterday that some bombs were sent into Iran, and they summoned some troops on the Azerbaijan-Iranian border. So Iran is mobilizing, not a massive mobilization, but is also sending troops to the area, which only can complicate the situation on the ground and diplomatically. So here we are in terms of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I'm listening to you. Yeah, here is map number 4, I think, which we have not used. Now, since we have much, thank you, Misha. Since we have this map here, let me just show you.
Here's Armenia, and here's Turkey, and here's Azerbaijan.
Someone, I can hear someone speak. Since you see this map, here in pink, sort of, you have Turkey, Georgia here in yellow, Azerbaijan is in green, and then you have here this small territory, which is Nagorno-Karabakh, and the rest of this Yerevan, this is Armenia. Now, to show you how much this Nagorno-Karabakh area is locked into Azerbaijan, you see at the bottom of the map here, in a sort of off green, or you can see Nakhichevan region. The Nakhichevan region also is part of Azerbaijan. So you see that Armenia is surrounded actually by Azerbaijani territory, and that normally Nagorno-Karabakh, geographically speaking at least, would be part of Azerbaijan. So I don't know exactly how this is going to end. Oh yeah, I forgot also to tell you that in the light of the collapse of all these ceasefire attempts by France, by Russia, by the United States, the Minsk group has decided to meet on this coming Thursday in Geneva. I don't know yet if Azerbaijan and Armenia will be represented at the time, at the talks. But again, the group, these countries, and I don't know if there will be only the chairs of these countries, the US, France, and Russia, or the whole group. There are about 20 countries which are part of this group, which will be meeting in Geneva. But I know that there will be a meeting on Thursday, considering that none of the chairs has been successful in bringing the two parties to the table, to the negotiating table, not necessarily to resolve the conflict that might take a long time, and but at least to stop the fighting for now. All right, taking your questions, except that, Michel, oh, here we go. That's better. Thank you. The first question actually is from Larry. Does the Kurdish population of Eastern Turkey and Western Armenia have any role in the conflict? Not to my knowledge. The Kurds have not been involved in the fighting, although there might be a few exceptions here and there, but I don't believe so. The Kurds have their own issues. I don't know if they've been affected in any way by the fightings, and if they take any part in it. From Sherry, is the UN playing any role in addressing the issues? If not, why not? If yes, what is being done? No, the UN for the time being, as far as I know, there was a meeting of the Security Council the other day, but everything is virtual also at the United Nations. They meet online, like us. And there was no decision. I think the decision was left to the Minsk group, since they all part of the United Nations, to try and work out some kind of arrangement between the two countries. But to my knowledge, the meeting was just exchanges of insults and between the two representatives from Armenia and Azerbaijan, but nothing concrete. Now, Armenia might have, Azerbaijan might be strongest or stronger militarily. However, Armenia has in the public relation area. Armenia might have the upper hand. That's where they have a huge asset, which is the Armenian diaspora, which is very large, both in the United States, actually, and in Europe. In France, there is a very large Armenian community, and also in the Middle East and in Africa. For instance, in the Middle East, Lebanon has a very large Armenian community. They are Christian Orthodox. And they have raised incredible amounts of money, and they have been extremely active, again, in the public relation arena to try and help the government of Armenia by influencing the politicians in the country where they live, whether Lebanon or France or the United States or others, to take position not necessarily in favor of Armenia, but to try and to make up for the support that Azerbaijan has been receiving from Turkey, for instance. Again, unlike Azerbaijan, Armenia does not have too many resources, does not have a lot of gas, natural gas or oil. In contrast to Azerbaijan, which, as I mentioned to you, since the beginning of the 90s, since it became independent, basically, has been exporting a lot of its wealth, and with the money received from those exports, could set up a very modern army. But again, the conscripts are not particularly enthusiastic to fight, and so far the Armenians could resist, and Nagorno-Karabakh people could resist to Azerbaijan. So we'll see what will happen. From Dawn, other than selling weaponry to Azerbaijan, does Israel have any strategic concerns in this area? I do not believe so. Its role is basically selling its weapons to countries which have the financial means to buy them, and Azerbaijan happens to be one of them. Plus, for Israel to have, again, good relations with a Shiite Muslim country can only be a plus. So that's politically, I see it's definitely beneficial to Israel. But otherwise, strategically speaking, for the area, I do not see any advantage. Speaking of Israel, you might have seen also that Israel has been holding discussions with Lebanon next door, a country with which Israel is technically at war, on the exploitation of Eastern Mediterranean that I mentioned last week or a couple of weeks ago when you spoke about Turkey's drillings in the area. And Lebanon, since this area seems to have a lot of natural gas, Israel and Lebanon are discussing the border between the two of them when it comes to the economic zone between the two countries. So Israel might be able to exploit, if actually it finds significant reserve of oil or gas in the Mediterranean, might be, it will be easier for them actually to drill and find it off the Israeli coast than going into Central Asia for it. From Rick, from which countries or country does the natural gas originate, or on the way to Western Europe? Well, as I mentioned earlier, from Azerbaijan, from Turkmenistan, and from Kyrgyzstan in particular. Those are the three, excuse me, those are the three former Soviet republics, which are oil and gas rich. So through the pipelines that were built, the gas is flowing, so to speak, to Western Europe, through Russia or through Turkey. From Sherry, Israel gets oil from Azerbaijan. That's a statement. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, that was a statement, and that
okay.
is
okay. You know for a fact.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons behind Israel refusing to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. They don't want to destroy relationships with Azerbaijan.
All right, so that explains probably to some extent. I didn't know that. It explained to some extent why they selling Azerbaijan arms. Okay. You have any? I think we have. Are we done with Azerbaijan and Armenia? So it shows maybe this. It is clear to you, which I'm happy to see. Or it's so complicated that you don't want either one of them. But I hope it's now it's clearer to you what's going on in between those two countries in the area. From Peggy, how often do those pipelines spring leaks or explosion? I don't know. Why should they? That's a very interesting question, but why should they?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because there is such a big dispute here in this country about pipelines running through to the coast. And they're talking that, the fear of explosion and leaks.
I don't know if the issue here, you mean in the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if the issue is over the explosions. The issue is over pollution, not so much explosion.
Well, they talk about them running under agricultural land here in the Midwest.
That's another, yeah, exactly. That's
one of the fears.
That's a Canadian pipeline. Yes.
One of the fears is leaking and explosions and polluting the fields.
Leaking could be. Explosions, I don't know. But anyway, for
but you don't hear about it in Europe.
For the environmental, there are environmental concerns in this country. Over there, I don't believe that much. Over there, the economic advantages and financial advantages trump any concern with environmental concerns.
Okay.
From Robert, what is the significance of the Israeli agreement with Sudan? As a matter of fact, Robert, I was planning on looking at all these agreements that Israel signed in the past month and a half. With Bahrain, with United Arab Emirates, with now with Sudan. I just don't know when, because next week it all depends on. I'm monitoring closely the situation in Belarus. Today, the main opponent to Lukashenko over there, this lady called who left Belarus and lives today in next door in Lithuania. Her name is Tikhanovskaya. She called for a general strike in Belarus, and I'd like to see the outcome of this general strike to gauge what public support Lukashenko still has in his country, and also to what extent his repression, people arrested and beaten up, and his repression has been efficient. And to what extent this popular strike is followed before, and probably I'm not the only one, but the Russians are looking at it also very, very closely to see what will happen in Belarus in the near future. They have been having these demonstrations now for 11 consecutive Sundays with huge crowds in the streets of their main cities. But so far, Lukashenko does not seem to have been affected. And the Russians obviously have not intervened so far. So let's see what happens this week, and maybe next week we'll be looking at next week, by the way, which is one day before the elections here. We'll be looking at Belarus. So to go back to Israel, I was trying to find a date for us to look at all these agreements that Israel has been signing with the Arab Muslim countries. I still haven't found a date because obviously on the 9th we'll be looking at the elections, or the results, the outcome of the elections, if we have any, by the way. That remains problematic, is problematic also. So it's still up in the air, but I like to spend one lecture on this issue. Now, to go back to your question, in itself, it's very significant. Let's
What was the question?
face it. It's something. Every time that Israel signs, actually, they haven't signed anything yet. They have decided to not even to normalize relations with Khartoum, but to
Trade.
not to be in war anymore with them in a way. So for the time being, it's more symbolic than anything else. Unlike the first agreement, for instance, with Egypt and Jordan, which were neighbors, it was mostly political and strategic, extremely important. Then came, well, not right away, but then came last month, the two Gulf countries, which is also extremely important, not so much strategically, but economically, considering the weight, financial weight, and the economic weight that those two, the Emirates and Bahrain represent. So that's very important also. And it happens to be also in the area, which in a way facilitates communication between Israel and a couple of countries in the Gulf, and reduces Israel's geographic, if you will, isolation in the area. With Sudan, that's somewhat different. It doesn't go that far, but it's again another, if you will, another nail in the coffin of the Palestinian Authority, because basically Sudan is one of the countries which has been particularly vocal in opposing any type of deal with Israel as long as the Palestinian issue was not resolved. So obviously by recognizing Israel per se, that weakens the positions of the Palestinian authorities even further. So that I call it, that's the main significance, not so much in what Israel could get from Sudan and Sudan from Israel, but from the fact that indirectly it weakens the positions of the Palestinian Authority even further. Khartoum, for instance, capital of Sudan, that's where the Arab countries after the war in 73, I think they all got together to sign a statement saying no to the recognition of Israel, no to any type of relations with Israel, as long as the Palestinian issue is not resolved. And now, in 2020, there is another country, a Muslim country, that just drops that condition, with more to follow, I guess, because Oman apparently is prepared to deal with Israel, and eventually, I guess, Saudi Arabia will also, although the Saudis are probably a little more cautious, but there have been a lot of unofficial contacts between the Saudis and Israelis. So this can be expected in the future. It also depends on how the elections turn out here, but that's another story. From Tom, I understand that the border area with Iran in this region had terrorist attacks and unrest for many years. Naturally, the USA called them freedom fighters, and Iran calls them terrorists. Oh, you mean terrorist attacks against the government in Tehran? Who are these individuals ethnically, and what is their background and relationship with both Armenia and Azerbaijan?
That's an interesting question.
I don't know the answer.
You do?
No, I'm not going to answer it.
Do you know what I'm speaking of, Pierre? I know that initially when America was complaining, can you hear me? Not very well. When America was complaining about Iran backing.
Now it's much better. You closer to the microphone, or?
Yeah, I had a pillow over my face initially. I was trying to smother myself, but I decided not to.
Don't do that.
Prior to the election. But my understanding is that there was terrorist cells and ethnic unrest in northern Iran, and that when the United States was complaining about Iran backing terrorism abroad, Iran was turning around and saying, well, you're doing that in our borders, and you've been supporting these individuals and these cells for a long time in northern Iran. So I was wondering who they are and what their demands are and what the background is, if you have any of that.
I believe most of them are Shia Iranians. And also, I don't know how much the US, again, obviously the US does not publicize this. So I have no way of knowing. What I do know that this group.
Sudan is a Shiite country. Then why would there be terrorists?
I can hear you. I cannot hear. Anyway, I continue. What I do know that during the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein set up some groups, Iranians call them terrorists, who indeed operated in Iranian territory against the Iranian army. And some of them survived, so to speak, over the years. And they were still, to some extent, I guess, financed and backed by Iraq. Now, even though most of Iraqis are Shiites also, but there is a very large Sunni majority. Now, does the United States, through Iraq, finances those groups? I don't know exactly who they are, but I know that they've been relatively active, even much less so since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and the fact that Iran now has a lot of influence in Baghdad, in Iraq, so on the Iraqi government. So probably the Iraqi government has held these groups accountable, and they monitor them closely. But it seems to me that some of these fighters were Sunnis, Iraqi Sunnis fighting Iran. And but to what extent they are still active nowadays, Iran doesn't give out any numbers or doesn't mention any activity right now, whether for political reason or otherwise. I have no way of knowing. And obviously, if the US is trying to finance these groups, they are not going to advertise them. So I don't know exactly really who these people are and what their goal is really. From Stu, what would happen if these gas lines were sabotaged? Like with every gas line which is sabotaged, probably it wouldn't be a nice picture to see when they are blown up. I don't know what would happen, but the consequences would be the gas flow would stop, and the lines would have to be repaired and fixed. Beyond that, I have no way of knowing really what would happen if they are sabotaged.
I'm not talking about the flow of gas. I'm talking about the political ramifications. The political ramifications of those lines.
Well, I guess like every time something like this happens too, would be each country would be accusing the other one of having blown up the lines.
I mean, they're having a lot of disagreements right now, and if someone would take that action, who knows what would happen? Absolutely,
I agree with you, and that is why I think that for the time being, as I mentioned, Russia is very careful in trying to avoid any kind of sabotage on the pipelines, because for now anyway, they have enough issues within the former republics in Europe, and also in Kyrgyzstan, as you saw, they changed government there recently, and not constitutionally. So the Russians have a lot of issues also with Belarus and Ukraine, not to mention Libya and Syria. So for the time being, they are trying to hold a cover over what's happening in Armenia and Afghanistan. But again, considering their track record in terms of blackmailing the West with cutting the gas supply to West Germany, for instance, probably they would not hesitate. It remains to be seen. I don't know what the outcome will be, and I don't know if the Russians, who are going to Geneva also on Thursday, and who apparently were very active in trying to reach a ceasefire, as I said 2 weeks ago, are going to work sincerely with France and the US to achieve some kind of truce for now, or they might consider that it's to their advantage to continue agitating in that region and trying to talk Armenia into starting fighting again, considering how close these pipelines are to the front line. From Alan, I read that the agreement between Israel and Sudan is contingent on approval by Sudan parliament, which may not be a slam dunk. Can you comment on that? Yes, I read the same thing, Alan, and indeed, it's not done yet. That being said, I don't think that the United States would have announced an agreement with the Sudanese government, and the Sudanese government would not have come out publicly to announce an agreement with Israel, particularly, without making sure that internally a majority of the members of the parliament would go for it. So I assume that if there is a active minority of members of the Sudanese parliament who are opposing any type of peace accord or recognition of Israel per se, the Sudanese government must have made sure that they have a majority which would approve it. Do not forget also that this whole agreement came about because the US decided to take Sudan off the list of terrorist countries, which is a huge advantage for, this is a carrot, actually, the main carrot for Sudan for having, in a way, recognized Israel, is that now with the country being off the list of terrorists or terrorist supporting countries, they'll have access to the American financial market. They will be able to do business normally, to sell and buy. They would not be subjected to economic sanctions anymore, which in itself is the biggest incentive for Sudan to go along with such a deal, which basically doesn't cost them too much. From Peggy, are the pipelines owned by a country, by the countries through which they pass, or are they private companies? I don't know exactly. I believe that the companies which exploit or drill the oil, they own the oil which flows through the pipelines, but the pipelines themselves belong to the country through whose territory they go. It seems to me. I'll have to look it up to make sure. But logically speaking, although it might not be logical. But logically speaking, I would say that the pipelines themselves belong to the country through which they go. The oil, that's a different story. That's a company that exploits and drills for the oil. Anything else?
Pierre.
Yes.
Can I comment on something that you spoke about last week?
You can comment on anything you want.
Oh, don't give me that much of an opening. You never know what I'll say then.
But please, please. You see how secure how sure I feel. You can say anything you want to say.
I'm sure of you. I'm just not sure of myself. No, we were talking last week about what took place, the tragedy in France, in terms of when the professor was beheaded in. And I just wanted to comment on something. It's, probably all of the people even in this group are probably all Christian and Jewish. And we all approach things from that perspective. I think it's interesting to try to look at it from a Muslim perspective around the world now. Something like that happening is terrible, and it gets a lot of press. A nut goes out there and beheads somebody. But for Muslims in the world today, they're seeing genocidal actions taking place in Myanmar with the Rohingyas. They're seeing that in China with the Uyghurs, millions of people basically being ethnically cleansed. They're looking at the United States, which says that it supports democracy everywhere, where we have a history in terms of backing Mubarak in Egypt, Assad in Syria, the Shah in Iran, Suharto in Indonesia, Gaddafi even when Gaddafi, we were out on the outside with him at one time, but then we came to accommodations with him. The House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, they look at Trump looking to have a Muslim ban to keep Muslims entirely out of the United States. They even look when there's Muslim on Muslim violence around the globe, such as the Saudis in Yemen and the Iraqis Iran war, usually one side is a proxy for the West. One side is being backed by the West and such. But I was thinking that we see fundamentalism and radicalism being fueled in the Muslim world, but from a perspective of a young Muslim watching what's going on in the world, there's a sense that they are, if not being disenfranchised, actually being wholesale murdered. How many, perhaps over 1 million Muslims have died in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which have taken place over the last decade. I just wanted to try to appreciate it from that perspective. Of course, what happens was terrible in France, but when one person dies in something like that, the whole world goes ooh and ah. But when they're watching what's going on in something like with the Uyghurs and with the Rohingyas, they feel that their people are being basically slaughtered all about the globe, and they feel that they're being basically ignored in terms of what's taking place, their plight around the world. I just wanted to throw that out to you and such.
Well, it's an interesting point that you bring up, and you're not the only one. It's been a public debate, one more public debate, I should say, since the beheading happened last week in France. As you can see, or you might have seen in the papers, the reaction has been, in some of the countries, Muslim countries, has been very violent towards Macron in particular. You must have seen that Erdogan attacked him personally yesterday and the day before yesterday, telling him publicly to have his head checked because he's mentally ill for singling out Muslims in those countries. Other countries in the Gulf called for boycotting French products. also. And even the king of Morocco, who's a great friend of France and ally, came out this morning publicly saying that it's very offensive. The French policy towards Muslims is very offensive. Now, the debate has been going on, but there are a number of things here. The French has tried to make, very carefully, tried to make a distinction between Islam, which is a religion, and which everybody can practice in France. The 5 or 6 million Muslims are free to practice the way they want in France. And Islamism, which is basically extremist interpretation of the Quran, of the Muslim religion, which leads to what we saw the other day. Also, number two, the reaction was so violent on the part of the French authority, because this is the first time when a teacher is being punished for having done something which was perceived by a number of Muslims as offensive to them. A teacher. And this is very important for the French, in that secularism and laicity in France has been around since early 20th century. And the French have been very careful to separate the church and religion from school. For the French, a school is a space which teaches young minds to, number one, impregnate themselves, if you will, with the values of the Republic, égalité, fraternité, so on. And also to develop curiosity and intellectual curiosity. And so that is why France reacted so hard against, with the measures being taken now. For the time being, nothing really has changed, and it's very difficult to make changes in a country where you have 10% of the population which is Muslim, around 5 to 6 million people. Nobody knows. And the French have the feeling that, far from assimilation, like previous waves of, what is France? France is made up basically of migrants also. Recently, Italians, Portuguese, Spaniards who come to France in droves in the past 100 years or so. But those people and those communities, anyway, showed a willingness to assimilate. Unlike the Muslim population that came to France. And instead of assimilating, France tried to integrate them into the French life. It's not the same thing, assimilation and integration. Integration is to admit them into the French community. Assimilation is a desire on the part of the community to be part of what represents today France. So, faced with this refusal of not only of being assimilated, but also having these demands on France to respect their own religion and wearing the veil, having different type of food in schools, having special hours for going to the public swimming pools for girls and for boys, not shaking hands with women, including women teacher by Muslim men. All this has led the French, generally speaking, to look at this Muslim population as a population which is alien to the French, not only alien to the French culture and rejecting all kind of assimilation, but also trying to impose their own religion, because everything in the Muslim, unlike every other religion, main religion, the Muslim religion is a Muslim behavior, so to speak, is part of the religion. Everything is religious in the Muslim world, including the political. It's the Quran that decides what should be done. And you know what Islam means. Islam means submission in Arabic. So for the French who did the French Revolution, the law of God was overtaken by the law of people, of human rights. Unlike, in contrast, in the Muslim world, the law of people is inferior to the law of God, and everything should be following the law of God. So look at it this way. Obviously, it clashes with the French principles, and therefore you have this issue, and therefore you had this reaction for the French authorities, which believe nowadays that the Muslims in such numbers, they brought a war of civilization or a clash of civilization into Europe, and particularly into France, considering their huge numbers. Again, 10% of the population. Now, as to the support by Western European countries to dictators in the Arab world. First of all, you should give me an example of an Arab world which is democratic, based on our Western principles. There is none, to my knowledge.
But have we really cultivated that, though? Did we really cultivate that, though? That's the thing I'm saying. It's kind of what made the Arab Spring a little bit of an embarrassment for us, because we had to sit there then and watch as they were getting rid of the people that we basically had been backing for years.
Yes,
guys like the head of Tunisia.
I agree with you.
And then we
up to a point, I agree with you.
It is kind of a gray area.
I'll let you finish then.
It's kind of a gray area because, like, for instance, we could say, democracy didn't develop in the Middle East, but when the main standard that would have been for democracy in the Muslim world would have been Iran, and then we overthrew Mossadegh and we instituted the Shah, and that was because it was good for us.
Not because I understand. I understand what you're saying, but this is not because the U.S. was supporting particularly democracy in Iran. I don't believe that during the Mossadegh era, Iran was a democratic country, okay? Number one. Obviously, replacing him to the Shah, strategically speaking and economically speaking, was important to the United States. I don't think they looked at Mossadegh as someone who was a Democrat. They overthrew him because he tried to nationalize the oil, as you very well know.
But that's my point, is that when it suits our purposes financially, but we do that all over the globe. But it's kind of, then we say to the Arab world, we say, how dare you not be democratic? And we really don't make that great of an effort to try to support democracy there.
Yes, but then you would be right if during the Arab Spring, you gave me the example of the Arab Spring, I would agree with you if in all these countries where you had a revolution, so to speak, okay, the dictators had been replaced with democrats. But what did we see in Egypt? Mubarak was replaced by a Muslim brother.
The Muslim Brotherhood.
By the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not exactly the most democratic, you agree with me, group.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But you know what happens? It's like a dam. It's like instead of letting the pressure off it, what happens is when it blows, it's like a pendulum. It ends up swinging to the opposite extreme. If we'd had like a Mossadegh in Iran, we probably would have had a natural development of something resembling democracy. But when you had the Shah for 25 years, holding the people down, eventually what happens is it swings to the opposite extreme then, and we end up with that fundamentalism, and we end up with that, you know, that's what I fear.
It's not as clear as you make it sound. It seems to me that when Khomeini came back to Iran, most people in Iran, I agree with you, were very happy to get rid of the Shah, all right? They didn't particularly want Khomeini, which I remind you was in exile at the time in Paris, in France, where he lived for 5 years. And the French authorities believed that Khomeini would be a moderating and temporary factor in Iran for a short period of time. When Khomeini himself promised elections in Iran, free elections for the first time in 25 years, or I don't know, since the Shah had been in power. And then he was a religious, basically, he was a religious source of power. So he wasn't going to stay in power. It was temporary. And then things have changed in Iran. Now, how much they changed because they were imposed by the religious groups in Iran, and how much they changed because people by reaction wanted someone like Khomeini, I don't know. What I can tell you is that today, so many years later, if you have a referendum, a free elections in Iran, I don't think the majority of the population is so delighted to have the Ayatollahs in power in Tehran. So,
oh, I agree with you. I think, in fact, these people are probably worse for the people of Iran than the Shah was.
Okay, so
you know, but what happens is by our meddling, it ends up blowing back on us. You know what I mean?
Whenever these dictators were replaced by other people, the situation got worse in those countries in terms of dictatorship. The only exception to some extent is Tunisia today, which conducted a relatively safe uprising, and they have a relatively democratic country where the religious party is a moderate party. And Tunisia seems to be doing relatively well. But in countries like Egypt, because Mosri brought in the army and the coup with al-Sisi. In Egypt, where in Bahrain, whereas Tunisia and Syria, obviously, where the Arab Spring were most active. The changes, to me anyway, looking at the changes, were not positive. So we are meddling, yes, but every leading superpower, considering the importance of the Middle East, is meddling. Let's not be naive. It's not only the United States. Russia is meddling just as much as the United States in
of course.
In the Middle East. So the US has a choice. Shall we withdraw altogether from the Middle East and leave it to Russia? You saw the situation in Syria, what happened in Syria. Personally, I don't believe it's a great idea to just declare victory and pull out. So it's very difficult to take sides. You know, the Muslims might have a point, but again, themselves, the way the Muslim minorities operate or act in countries in Western Europe doesn't make their cause particularly popular with the locals, so to speak. Also in France, to go back to France, which I know best, obviously from as far as the Muslim influence over there. As we saw Germany last week, but it's the same situation, similar in France. The immigration of a very large Muslim population to France had as a result, they brought in with themselves the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which again resulted in a spike in a number of anti-Semitic acts, the like of which have not been seen since the Nazi occupation back in the 40s. That doesn't help either. That makes it very difficult for the French authorities to deal with it. And unlike other countries, France had this, the situation where most of these Muslim immigrants hold also French passports. They are dual citizens. So you have today 5 million or 5.5 million Muslims in France. Not all of, again, they are not Islamists, not all of them. There is a little minority of, I don't know how many anyway, but which is active enough to create what they create nowadays in France and in Europe. So it's a very complex situation, and I don't know the answer as to how this can be resolved. Blasphemy, to go back to the drawings of Mohammed in the French press, blasphemy is legally blasphemy, including making fun of religion, any religion, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish. It's a French tradition in a way. And these newspapers have been full of, well before these publications came out, had been shown in French newspapers. There was never any issue with that. Blasphemy is liable with capital punishment in some of these Arab countries. I understand. But, you know, at the same time, the French are arguing, after all, this is our culture and this is our country. And we understand the Muslim reaction. However, they should also understand that in our countries, this is something that is done traditionally, and it shouldn't generate this type of violence on the part of the Muslim community. So it's very complicated, really is.
You know, if we could just get Muslims to treat religion the way Catholics do, we could solve that. Just ignore it. I'm joking about that, of course, but you know how yeah. Catholics basically take dogma and just put it aside and such. But it's just interesting to see it from I remember something during the Serbian intervention in the United States. I had Muslim friends at the time who were absolutely amazed that the United States went out and tried to protect Muslim lives from Christians, that they actually fought to protect Muslim lives. In the eyes of many Muslims, they think of the West as just either belittling them or pouncing on them. And they were genuinely astounded that the United States under Clinton took a position to defend the lives of Muslims in Kosovo. Though, as one Muslim friend of mine pointed out, those were European Muslims. It wasn't Muslims in the Middle East, number one. And number two, of course, they wanted to maintain stability in Europe, whereas the Balkans is the back door to instability there. But that's the way to understand how I'm not Muslim myself. I'm a failed Catholic, but they have a perspective where they feel that they're kind of at the bottom of the heap. They really don't have any influence and power in affairs around the globe, and they feel that they're just being kicked about. I remember back in Texas a couple years back, they opened up a carnival mocking Muslims right next to a Muslim community. Well, a guy grabbed a gun and went in there to try to do something about it, and they shot him. All right. But then people were saying, well, why don't they just ignore that? Why did they get upset? Well, if I was to go to the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn and open a kiosk mocking Judaism, how long do you think that would go on for before I'd be dismembered? If I was to go to an evangelical community and begin mocking Christ, open up a kiosk doing that, how long do you think it would be before I was shot? They're Christians and Jews have a certain amount of power and a certain amount of influence that Muslims do not have. And Muslims feel that they're being asked basically to lie down and be mocked. And I agree with you, they are extremists and such in many cases with their religion, but I think that it's only fueling this fire by sitting there mocking them and by what they see around the globe in terms of the ethnic cleansings and the wars taking place.
Well, I would say it's mostly based on the fact that everything in the Muslim way of life is based on religion, including their political system, and that doesn't work very well in our societies, where we are more individual, we are more cynical to some extent, and we don't pay as much attention to religion, or even very little or not at all. And for France, the example of France, which is the secular country by definition, it just doesn't go well. So it's a very difficult issue. It's a very complex issue. That being said, once again, I, as a journalist, I cannot condone any violent reaction of this type. Nothing justifies it. I'm sorry, but that's my opinion.
Neither do I, Pierre. If I was on that bus, I would have fought to protect that man.
Absolutely.
I'm just saying,
justified.
I can understand
that you might get upset. I can understand that we can have a civilized discussion about it, but I do not understand killing someone because he tried to teach his who's a teacher in itself.
Pierre, what I'm saying is, if I was on that bus,
I would in his own country and trying to be actually to be very careful not to offend the Muslim kids in his class, because if you read the reports, he first, before showing the drawings as an example of freedom of expression, he asked the Muslim kids in the class to leave the classroom for a couple of minutes if they felt they would be offended by showing these drawings, or to turn their heads. So he wasn't insensitive to the Muslim kid. This was not the first year he showed this. That was part of his courses of his class. to show the kids what freedom of expression meant. Okay, and that was the reaction to it from a kid who had nothing to do with that school, who was not in his class, who came from actually a different area than that was where the school was, and who asked other kids to show him the teacher because he saw on internet some reports which were totally false, in which the teacher was accused of mocking the Muslim religion, when his intent was just to show that people could express themselves freely. So, there is a set of circumstances there.
Pierre, I'm a fan of France, believe me, and I understand.
No, it's not a question. It so happened that this incident was in France. Okay, could have been Germany, could have been Spain.
Oh yeah,
could have been any other country. It's not because it was France. I'm not taking the defense of France. I'm just saying you in what circumstances this incident took place. So again, no matter what, now that being said, no matter what, I cannot condone violence.
Neither do I. And like I said, if I was on that bus, I would have fought to defend that professor. And if I need be, use lethal force to defend him and such. But I'm saying is, I'm understanding why this is being touched off. I don't condone it, but I understand how it's fueling radicalism. Because his response probably was not just to this. He's probably sitting there watching what's happening in Myanmar and watching what's happening in China and hearing Trump say, well, to the Chinese, he said, oh, you're putting them in concentration camps? Oh, that sounds like a good idea. When you see that... Do you see what I'm saying?
I don't think that
it builds up.
Went as far as telling the Chinese, go ahead and take care of all the Uyghurs and put them in concentration camp.
He said it was a good idea. He actually was quoted. He said it was a good idea.
Well, again, anyway, we moved far from Azerbaijan, not for Azerbaijan, but for Armenia, the poor guys are Orthodox Christians. But to go back to Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's not a religious conflict, okay? Even today, even though the Turks or the Iranians might try to, fuel some kind of, it's a regional conflict between two countries which claim a piece of land there. But for now, anyway, it hasn't been of religious nature. So thank God for that.
Azerbaijanis are very secular, extremely secular. They're Shiites, but they're very secular. Thank God.
Well, it's not only that, but don't forget, as I said also in my presentation, both countries were part of the Soviet Union, right? We taught as an atheist state. I mean, there was, officially there was no religion in the Soviet Union, except the religion of Leninism and Stalinism, but there was no religion. So all this generation grew up to now, actually. And those countries in Central Asia, which are mostly Muslim, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, most of those are Muslim and secular Muslim countries. Here is an example for you, since we're mentioning secular Muslim countries. Here are examples of your states which are Muslim, majority Muslim, and yet not Islamist, even though there are a number of young people who went to Syria and fight with the jihadists, but very, very few. Because they have been brought up secularly for 30 years. So there is not the religion hasn't played an important role so far there. That being said,
Albania as well, right?
to go back to what you're saying, they are still dictatorships, okay? Because the leaders who were in charge of those countries in the communist era, from one day to next, they became so-called liberals, okay? But they are still at the head of the country, not as communists anymore, but as liberals. So anyway, I guess we'll be done for today. Thank you very much, Michelle, if you're still with us. Oh, there was one more question by Claire, which I didn't see. What, if anything, is going on in North Korea that would affect the United States? Well, to make it very short for you, or we can discuss it maybe next week. Now it's almost 1:45. To make a very short reply, not much to my knowledge. There is not much going on in North Korea for now, or at least our attention is somewhere else than North Korea for a change. So we're going to look at North Korea and all these areas where the United States diplomacy has a role to play, which is all over the world. Basically, when we look at the U.S. diplomacy and U.S. foreign affairs after the elections. Anyway, in the meantime, be well, be safe, and I see you all hopefully next Monday, and thank you very much. And thank you, Michelle, if you can hear me now. All right, see you next week. Bye-bye.
Just in time for the election.
That will be the day before the election. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.